off. I don't know if there's a problem. Off, and they're like saying that the ricer she drives home or like I don't know, somebody gets dropped off. And they like exchange phone numbers and she's like, yeah, like working out there. Yeah, we're in the same comments from like no one. I used to so much, but we're more focusing on. And he's like, about what? It wasn't like two people like just joking. It was a whole thing. And he's like, sees the picture. This is her. This is her. And I was like, so I was like, wait. So what's the resolution? So I was like, what's the resolution? He's like, this was last week. There is no resolution. Right, so we were hanging out the store for like half a second. Just for our buddies, like that. We were like maybe like escaping abusive relationships. And even then, it's like, she's from like Amarillo, went to Boston. It's not like she went to, middle of nowhere. She was flying across the so I was pretty smart. He wasn't deadheading. So weird. I don't think they were doing a lot of this. So weird. This is
So how was my idea? Show us cards after this?
Like pull somebody over or something.
Yeah, I mean, so quiet.
I wanted this since 14, even knowing that because of that. I don't know if that is wild. Yeah. And I dug one this guy's house on his one of the most stuff I just listed it all. Which is, I suspect that's the problem. I actually have a swipe phone. I would probably recognize it out as like right, you're gonna get. Yeah. So you wouldn't even know.
Johnson. I sent it to Johnson and Johnson. How are you guys?
I don't want to know anymore.
No. It's a really cool movie. So it looks like the principals are making their way to the room, so everyone can take their seats.
Absolutely.
All right, thank you all very much for coming. My name is David Edmondson. I'm the Executive Director of Austin Tech Alliance. First of all, I want to thank Capital Factory for offering this wonderful venue to allow us to eat, drink, and be merry, as well as hear from some very smart people about an incredibly important topic. A little bit quickly about Austin Tech Alliance. We are a nonpartisan nonprofit with a mission to promote civic engagement in Austin's tech sector. So part of that involves educating folks who work in the tech sector on policy issues that impact them, and I think that today's discussion certainly fits well within that bucket. We are a member-based nonprofit, a 501c6. We have membership opportunities for both individuals as well as companies. I see a number of folks who are members here in the crowd, as well as some of our advisory board members, so I'm happy that y'all were able to make it out. If y'all are interested in learning more, just visit austintech.org or follow us on the Twitters at AustinTech. Now, it is my honor to introduce our stellar lineup today. First, on my left, Senator Mark Warner was first elected to the U.S. Senate in 2008 and re-elected in 2014. He serves on the Senate Finance, Banking, Budget, and Rules Committees, as well as the Select Committee on Intelligence, where he is Vice Chairman. He's the first in his family to graduate from college. And Senator Warner spent 20 years as a successful technology and business leader in Virginia before entering public office as governor of Virginia from 2002 to 2006. On the other side is Bobby Chesney, who holds the James Baker Chair and also serves as the Associate Dean for Academic Affairs at the University of Texas School of Law. Welcome. In addition, he is the director of the Robert S. Strauss Center for International Security and Law, a university-wide research unit bridging across disciplines to improve understanding of international security issues. And finally, in the middle, our moderator is Jamie Metzel. Jamie is a senior fellow of the Atlantic Council, as well as a technology futurist, geopolitical expert, and sci-fi novelist. He previously served as the executive vice president of the Asia Society, deputy staff director of the U.S. Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and senior coordinator for international public information at the U.S. State Department. So without further ado, let's give a warm round of applause for these wonderful folks who are here.
Thanks so much, Dave. Thanks so much to all of you. Whenever I'm, and all of us are at South by Southwest, you realize that people's attention is the most scarce resource. So just coming here is great, and we know you're here because the topic is exciting, and because Bobby and I are exciting, but especially because we have Senator Warner, who's really been such an important leader, really I would say hero on these issues, because our country, as we have been talking about, is really in trouble. We have the greatest assets in the world, and that gives us some of the greatest vulnerabilities. When I was on the National Security Council in 1997 and 1998, my then boss and now close friend was a guy named Richard Clark, who many of you may have known as the person who wrote the memo essentially predicting 9/11 that was on George W. Bush's desk when the planes hit the Twin Towers. And at that time, Dick's big thing was, how can we look around the corners to see the challenges of the future? And he was talking about these two big issues. One was terrorism, and the other was cyber. And he would say, we are potentially facing the cyber equivalent of a Pearl Harbor. He was viciously attacked because people were saying, oh, this is just trying to make work, someone trying to make themselves important. And now, here we are, 20 years later, and our country has experienced a critical cyber attack. And we haven't had the cyber attack on our critical infrastructure that's shut the country down from an infrastructure perspective, but we have had a cyber attack that has shut the country down in many ways from a political perspective. And so even our understanding of the nature of the challenge we face has grown. And it's really difficult because we're always playing catch up. And even as we begin to understand the magnitude of the problem, it keeps morphing and changing. And so the problem of today is not the problem of tomorrow. And in a system where we tend to focus on understanding a problem as it exists, it's really difficult to then, especially in not just a whole of government, but a whole of society approach, to say, well, where is this problem going to be a year, 2 years, 3 years from now? And what do we do now to prepare for that eventuality or that possibility? So that's, I think, what we're here to talk about. We don't have a huge amount of time, so we're going to move through things relatively quickly, trying to understand essentially the nature of the threat and what are the things that we can do about it. So maybe first starting with you, Senator, and then you, Bobby, who by the way is my law school classmate. How would you characterize the nature of the cyber threat facing the United States?
Well, thank you, Jimmy. Let me also thank all of you guys for being here today. This is my third or fourth South by, and I think third time I've done an event at Capitol Factory. I would, and let me also step back, while I have a technology background, most of my time in politics has actually been more on the economic side than on the national security side. But the last couple of years, because the changing nature of the threat has really kind of put me into the deep end, is pervasive. I think it appears, I think, brought got people's attention a lot, what happened vis-a-vis the Russia threat and what they did in terms of interference in our elections in 2016, and I'll come back to that in a moment. But I think that is just one piece of a threat that also appears in the form of denial of service attacks. It appears in the form of attacks on critical infrastructure in countries like Ukraine. It appears in the form of potential attacks on our financial system, and I think we are, as a nation, woefully unprepared. I'm the vice chair of the intelligence committee. I would think, in the role I've got, I should know what America's cyber doctrine is. Now, I'm not a great fan of this current president, but this problem is not a problem that was just created by this president. This goes back a decade plus, since the middle of the 2000s. Our failure to have a cyber doctrine, I think in many ways, I can tell you what our strategy is vis-a-vis North Korea, Iran, ISIS, even within the cyber domain. But against near-peer adversaries like China and Russia, with relative impunity, have stolen our intellectual property, oftentimes using not just agents of the state, but agents of the state that are non-state actors, particularly in Russia, where you've got folks coming out of the oligarchs' criminal networks. They've stolen literally millions and billions of dollars. They have shown threats of the ability to shut down critical infrastructure. And then in 2016, they did the ultimate, at least Russia, take on our basic democratic institutions in a way that we were totally unprepared for. And I know we'll come back to strategy, I'm not sure we'll spread this around. And you probably are here because you want to know, if I'm going to give you the really good stuff. You gotta come to the later panel on that, about what happens between Mr. Trump and the Russians. But there are certain things that we absolutely know. We know that in a way that was frankly unprecedented, Russians hacked into both political parties and released information helping one candidate and hurting another in a way that weaponized information that we hadn't seen, at least in the recent past. We know they broke into, or at least rattled the door on 21 states' electoral systems. Didn't change any votes, but showed the vulnerabilities of our electoral systems, and we are not at all prepared to take on that challenge in terms of 2018. You guys in Texas just had primaries this past Tuesday. We are not ready as a nation in terms of election security. And they took a tool that I think even the United States government was not fully prepared to understand, the remarkable transformation that's taking place in social media with great iconic American companies like Facebook and Twitter and Google, others, and took our social media networks that have transformed our lives and showed, I would argue, the dark underbelly of what can happen by paid advertising, but that is the tiniest portion, but by creation of fake accounts, automated bots, click farms, and others that can drive a political debate in a way that we still are grappling in terms of trying to get our arms around it. So this is a pervasive threat. It is a threat to our government. It is a threat to our society. It's a threat to our institutions. And there needs to be a much greater sense of urgency, I believe, amongst all of us to try to get our act together.
Well, thanks, everybody. First, I want to thank the Senator for the incredible work that you and your colleagues on the Senate Select Committee have been doing in upholding standards and doing the job at a time when other people aren't. So thank you very much.
It's a low bar to get over.
It means a lot. Now, to the question, I agree with everything you said, and I'll just quickly add in a few things to make it sound worse. And I want to highlight a few things that are coming down the pike. I recently co-authored a piece at this blog called Lawfare Blog with my friend Danielle Citron, and we talked about something called deep fakes. I'd be curious, how many people have heard that phrase, deep fakes? So it's a term arising first and foremost out of the porn industry, where people manipulate video, put a fan.
I haven't heard about it.
Yeah. I should have said that first. But, so people are taking celebrity faces, superimposing them over videos, and you can imagine all the abuses to which this can be put. It doesn't take a lot of foresight to see how the expansion and diffusion of that technology to others is going to enable the information warfare things that the Senator was just talking about to take on, even have much more impact, to have much more immediate ability to disrupt. You can imagine something dropping in a 24-hour cycle right before voting day, for example, that absolutely wrecks something in a way that you can't quickly debunk. You can eventually debunk, but not quickly enough. So the information warfare problem, which is one part cyber, but many parts other things, but certainly something that our adversaries, Russia in particular, have proven to be adept at, it's going to get more complicated in the near future. That's just one of the fun things lying around waiting for us in the year ahead. And I think sooner rather than later.
And one of the things, Bobby, I've heard is that, I'll just shut it. If I'm a politician, I can be loud. You know, that I heard not only can you put somebody's face on another person's body, but if you have had a public life, for example, I've been a governor and senator, and you've got more than 40 hours of video of you in kind of stored, they can make sure, even with my real face, words come out of my mouth that I may have never said. So, you know, the deep fake is on one side in terms of faces on bodies, but you can even take your own body and make you say and do things that would be pretty wild in political context.
Yeah, it's really crazy. I mean, the whole idea that, Bobby, you've raised, the difference or the line between what we call cybersecurity and cyber warfare and information warfare, I mean, it's really critical. In 1996, I had an article in Foreign Affairs called Information Intervention. At that time, the basic idea was that in the Rwandan genocide, radio had been used to incite and then to organize the genocide. And it seemed to me at that time that information wasn't just about how we communicate. It was the primary means of distribution of power. And so that, like, blowing stuff up wasn't, I mean, if you blow up a lot, maybe you can change someone's behavior, but you blow stuff up to tell a story. And people internalize a story, and then their behavior changes, and that's how power is projected. So how would you differentiate, if at all, between cyber security, cyber warfare, and information warfare?
So it's interesting you said that. So earlier this week, I was at a United States Cyber Command, which is the military's combatant command for computer network operations. It was their annual legal conference. It was not off the record, but it was non-attribution, so I can't say who said this, but there was a fascinating discussion of just what you said. With the military audience, you're going to have everyone familiar with having read Clausewitz or von Clausewitz, and the idea of the enemy's center of gravity is what the military effort should be directed at. And several people were saying that we're entering into this sort of gray zone conflict period in which information, the information environment, or truth, or whatever preferred narrative you have, that's actually the center of gravity, instead of some sort of supporting activity that concerns the kinetic world that usually used to be the center of gravity. In my teaching capacity at the university, I've been in charge of an effort for a couple of years now to try to figure out how at the graduate level, across the different disciplines, computer science, law, public affairs, engineering, how do we best prepare people who are going to go into all those primary fields to be able to speak to one another and to cooperate in cybersecurity contexts of all sorts? And in that capacity, I've had to wrestle with this question of, what is this topic again? What exactly are the things encompassed under the heading of cyber? And of course, everyone you talk to tends to say something different. One person says, well, really, this is ultimately a problem about ubiquitous vulnerability, broadly diffused. There's not too much harm that would come to any one of us, but we're all vulnerable in certain ways, and the net effect is a big drag in our economy. Someone else says, it's about warfare, it's about the way that we're going to have a cyber Pearl Harbor, as Dick Clark had famously said. And of course, the answer is it's about all these things. It's a full spectrum. So when I crafted this curriculum that we've been developing, we try to survey, and we sort of start from what I think is the mom and pop issues of vulnerability for your business, for your personal information, exposure to ransomware, things that will be problematic but not the end of the world for you. But we try to show that systematically they matter tremendously for the United States as a whole. And it's a huge drag in our economy. And then it scales up from there, and there are certain things that are particularly strategically vulnerable. For example, if the financial markets come to believe that information and data is not trustworthy, that it can be accessed and not only stolen but manipulated, that will have a catastrophic effect on our economy. Who knows how we recover from that? And that's all before you get to the realms of cyber-enabled espionage, information operations that affect our elections and our very democracy. So there's a lot to cover there. It's not just one thing.
Yeah. And Senator, how broadly define this issue? It has a lot of big implications, but for you and for the government, it would have a major impact on just what is the jurisdiction of whom, and how are you thinking about defining all this?
Well, on the jurisdictional piece, it is a real bear. And to add what Bobby said, and I think he's dead on. I mean, this is not totally new. You cited the Rwanda example. You look at the Russians in terms of their tactics, in terms of misinformation, disinformation. They've been doing it a long time. Think about the fact that they tried to spread rumors that it was the American government that was behind the the assassination of Dr. King, or it was the American government that was behind the proliferation of AIDS as a disease. But they had to go through kind of old school media, or the old school of setting up a newspaper, or tactics that the Russians used in 2016 can spread into the private sector around brand reputation, around manipulation of markets. This is, and it's remarkably cheap. I often like to cite the fact that, again, as a quick aside on the Russians, the Russians did our innovation not only in our country, but they did in the Brits, the French. You add all that together. The Dutch elections, they hand counted all their ballots to make sure they were safe. You add that all up, those 4 countries, the cost, and it's less than the cost of one new F-35 airplane. So this is not only effective, but an extraordinarily cheap. And from a governmental structure standpoint, we have a real NSA, which has both a kind of offensive defense component, cybercom has been mentioned, and also the more intel community side of NSA. There's pieces of this that the CIA handles on your tone has not, we've sorted it out on paper, but in reality, I can tell you, we don't have our act together at all. And we appropriately have been, I think, enough concerned about dealing with Americans' personal information in our country communications network to be manipulated for inappropriate purposes. And the Russians clearly are not coming back to the Russians. I think the Chinese are also, you'll see more and more get into that in terms of their tech companies in particular. But as far back as 2011, I think the Russians realized they were not going to out-purchase us in terms of tanks and ships and guns and planes. But they needed to figure out a way to throughout all Western institutions.
And so for them, they began with a strategy, and then they implemented that strategy. And so that was why they could spend a little money, because they had the right strategy for them. I assume you believe, which I also believe, that we don't yet have a whole of government strategy. How do we think about a process for developing?
The notion of all the government silos, it's really hard. I mean, DHS was supposed to make sure that we didn't have this lack of coordination and collaboration that allowed 9/11 to come about. And while DHS has made some progress, we still, within the cyberspace and within the misinformation, weaponization of information, we do not have a coherent plan. Let me give you the 4 pieces that I would say ought to be part of the cyber doctrine. And I would start with the premise, and there is some debate whether we should even have an articulated cyber doctrine. I would argue you need that, but there are legitimate arguments about issues like attribution side. But the 4 pieces that I would argue where we eventually hope to get to would be, one, some of the powers of some of these tools are so enormous. To be able to shut down a critical infrastructure, be able to literally obtain millions to billions of dollars through ransomware, the ability to wipe a bank ledger clean. I think we may need, amongst major powers around the world, is think about, do we need to have some kind of basic norms, the same way the world created basic norms around the use and or non-use of chemical weapons and the use or non-use of nuclear weapons? Is there a way, even with near-peer adversaries like China and Russia, to find some kind of norms around what weapons should not be used? Yes, people are going to spy on each other, but what should be forbidden? And frankly, on what level, if a state or even a non-state actor breaks those rules, what are we willing to do back? Number 1. Number 2, and this is, at South by is an issue that would be fraught with a lot of pushback, I'm sure. But I think we at least ought to explore the notion of some level of liability, software liability. And how do you do it? And what's the duty of care? And huge amount of questions. I mean, France is starting down this path, but I would argue that a fulsome debate about at least on the software side, the providers of the underlying ecosystem, what kind of liability do they have? Third, we do need governmental reform, and we need to restructure some of our government, but there's some really low-hanging fruit. Again, this audience would totally get this, Internet of Things. We're going to go from 10 billion devices to 25 billion devices in our society within the next 5 years. I'm not exactly sure why we need our toaster connected to the internet, but so be it. Yet we have absolutely not even minimum security standards built into any of those devices. And what happens is now amongst I point out the vulnerabilities, but the guys who provide the cheaper devices, fight it like mad. They don't want to spend that extra 50 cents or $1. I think we may need at least to use the purchasing power of the government to say before, at least DOD, and I would argue for the whole of government, we ought to not be buying devices that are going to extend our vulnerability and start with that kind of standard. And then finally, back to the Russian analogy, we just plussed up dramatically our defense spending. We're now up to about $700 billion a year in defense spending. Russia's at about roughly 68 billion. Yet, we're at 10 to 1, yet they got us rocking on our heels in terms of their ability to use these tools to cost effectively really sow dissension in our country. I would argue, and that's even before we get to China with where their plan is on AI and 5G and quantum, I would argue from a national security standpoint, we may be investing in the best 20th century military that money can buy. And we ought to be thinking that a lot of the conflict in the 21st century is going to be in cyber, it's going to be in misinformation and disinformation, and a reallocation of some of those resources, I think would be worthy of a good debate. The last point I'll make on this is that the good news on this, on all of this issue, is at least to this point, there is no Democrat versus Republican position on cyber and misinformation and disinformation. Now, it made it a little more difficult on misinformation and disinformation in terms of the president's constant denial and his unwillingness to acknowledge this problem, but all of the men and women I work with in the Senate, Republican members, they know how serious this threat is. And you get into a pretty dark space in all of these conversations. Wouldn't it be great if, at least in this field, we found some common ground and there was actually an American position rather than R versus D?
Person can dream.
I hope that we can get there, but it's incredible, I think, for all Americans of any political background, except for that's officially yours. So I think everybody is so distraught that our country was attacked, that the attack was so severe and so targeted and so effective, and that this attack will happen in the future, and the politics will shift. I mean, at this time, the Russians clearly had a preference for Donald Trump, but in the future, some other actor will have a preference for somebody else. And that we can't, I know that you and others are trying, but we can't come together and say, this is a national problem, how can we fix it? It's just heartbreaking. I'll talk a little bit. Senator Warner mentioned China. I hope everybody has read, if you haven't, you should, China's national plan, the dominant country in AI by 2030, and the dominant overall country in the world by 2050. From you, and then we're going to build all the technologies of the future, and you'll have no choice but to buy those technologies from us. And so there are so many layers. I mean, there's the governmental layer, there's the non-state actors, there's just the technology layer, but the world is getting so much more complicated. I mean, we used to say it's like a multi-level chess game, but now everybody knows because of DeepMind that Go is more complicated than chess, so it's like a multi-layer, multi-dimensional Go game. How do we think about the challenge, the rivalry between the United States and China, and what it's going to mean in the cyber domain, and then connected to Senator Warner's question, how do we think strategically about responding to that threat?
So for a long time, the way we've viewed in the United States, the way we view China is that China is in this position of trying to catch up with us on the value chain. When it comes to their economic development, they obviously have a top-down system that enables pursuit of a top-down policy. And for decades, the American position has been, oh, isn't that cute? Look at them trying to catch up. They're getting there, but they'll never quite catch us. We'll just stay one step ahead of them. They can move somewhat up the value chain, but they'll never be as innovative as we are because of the openness of our system. I think it's time for a paradigm shift in how we look at this. I think it's time we recognize what China's strategy is at this point is to move away from catching up on the value chain by stealing our IP and leaving us to pursue whatever it is we've got to lead in while they move on to things that are the technology commanding heights of the future. And Jamie mentioned AI. AI is certainly part of this. Quantum computing will be part of this. Nanomaterials, and especially overlooked bioengineering. There have been a lot of Chinese acquisitions of cutting-edge US startups with incredible technology in genetic and other bioengineering spaces. All these things, of course, converge in certain ways, and we don't know exactly how these become the commanding high technologies of the future, but I think it's a pretty safe bet. And China is no longer just trying to figure out how to make a phone that's as good as the iPhone. They're no longer just trying to figure out how to make a car that's as good as Tesla's. They're trying to figure out how to dominate us and dominate the world technologically in the future, because, of course, any state would like this position. Technology is central to them in both an internal and an external respect. Internally, it's critical to regime stability and survival, which is job one for Xi Jinping and the Communist Party of China. You've got to control the information space in order to minimize dissent and cut off the possibilities of organized movements emerging that might challenge authority. And then closely related to that, economic growth requires further economic development at a really rapid pace. They've got no choice really but to pursue these sorts of strategies. And again, they've got the type of top-down, centralized, uniform approach to this that enables them to pursue it as I would say, a true whole of government, in American terms, a whole of government industrial policy that reaches through education, through business policies, economic policies, military intelligence, the whole 9 yards. Now to come back to the other part of the question, so what are we doing? We, as the senator said, we're just not organized that way. We've been making some strides, but it's really hard. And we have all sorts of complexities that they feel like bugs in this context, but they're also features, bugs and features. For example, our commitment, the senator mentioned our commitment to being careful with people's personally identifiable information. That's core to our conception of privacy in a free and open society. I'd like to layer in on top of that the idea of a post-Snowden hangover. And what I mean by that is that all of the turmoil unleashed from the Snowden revelations and the intense skepticism of U.S. intelligence community activities, especially NSA activities, that I think if we poll the average South by attendee, that's going to be kind of a resonant position with a lot of people. Snowden himself appeared here, I think, 1 year afterwards at South by. He virtually appeared, he didn't show up in person. That hangover makes it really hard to turn to the NSA and say as a matter of government policy, okay, what we're going to do here to protect elections or to protect certain key industries is we're going to let NSA get entirely into these networks and play a more outside of the IC type defensive role, even though that might actually be the single thing that might actually work on the defensive side. We're going to have to face some really hard choices in the years ahead. Getting past
and you want to have organic strawberries, that's the place to be. If you're a European and you want to have your data protected for you, that's the place to be. But in a world of AI and big data analytics, the future in some ways will belong to companies and countries that have access to massive, high-quality data sets and can mine them for insights into people's preferences, people's behaviors, people's genetics, people's biology. And on one hand, you think, God, it's really frightening if the state is going to be integrated, or big companies, whoever it is, going to be integrated, and they're going to have access to our most intimate personal information. That's a negative. On the other hand, a lot of power will come from that. And that's why there are going to be all these tensions. It's not going to be, oh, this is good, this is bad. It's going to be, maybe we have to do this really difficult thing because there's a bigger picture. And actually, to say there's a bigger picture, there's the Westworld show is here. But there's a bigger picture that's hard for us to see when we just look at ourselves. So, Senator, I know you've spoken a lot about a whole of government and actually a whole of society response to this challenge. You also have background, obviously, both in government and the private sector. How do we think about stitching these pieces together in a way that can, nothing will ever be perfect, but that can be more optimal than where we are. Now, how does government interact with business, and how do we give that message to engage the public so that the public won't be just terrified by what's coming?
You know, Jamie, that's a lot harder question than you asked Bobby.
You're the marquee guy here. That's what I'm paying the big bucks for. That's right.
No, it's gosh, you guys have both nailed it. I think there is the post-Snowden hangover. There is our concepts of privacy. Let me just kind of put some factoids out there that probably don't answer the question, because I don't think anybody is ready to get access to the Chinese market in terms of the sacrifices they've made on intellectual property, on source codes, on back ends, that they would never do for any other market in the world. You know, and I think we kind of allow that to happen. Yet I think we're also seeing then that there's this enormous sucking sound of all that intellectual property being kind of sucked out of those companies. I heard the other day, and this I'm not sure is accurate, but it is totally plausible. So if I'm wrong, put an asterisk and we'll come back and correct it. But I'm hearing that I heard the other day that a lot of the biomarker companies, you know, 23andMe and others, that when those swabs go, where the processing of all that information goes to China. And in the documents that's signed, there's an agreement that, you know, while your personal information is protected, all of that information remains grounded physically in that nation. As Bobby mentioned on the idea of where China is headed in terms of not playing for second, but saying we're going to leapfrog over the existing technologies, and I would add 5G to the AI and machine learning and the bio issues. And if you just look on the, you know, we start from a much bigger base, but you can see in a very few years with the ramp up of Chinese spend on R&D and the decreasing amount of American spend on R&D in these key areas, the lines about which country on a pure dollar basis or yuan basis, in terms of who investing more, China will soon pass us long before in the early 2020s. And then I think again we have presumed that China in particular would only create companies that would be in effect copies of ours. And most Americans have heard of, you know, Alibaba, Huawei, Tencent, Baidu. What I've discovered is, you know, there's another 15 to 20, all with $20 billion piece valuations that are all out there that most Americans have never heard of. And they are not copies, but in many areas they may be ahead of our American tech companies. And our current processes where we try to stop there, you know, where we try to evaluate whether a company should buy another company on national security areas, it's called CFIUS, is really kind of caught in the 20th century mindset, because a lot of what is happening is not buying a mature company now, but making that early stage investment, or frankly just entering the marketplace under their own brand name, and we have no way to kind of think through this. So again, you can get in pretty dark spots on these conversations, but this needs to be an issue of national propriety. I'll close with this. I saw the sign over here. If there was a company back on the Russian side for a while back, and this is the thing that so concerned me, for example, in the Chinese tech companies, called Kaspersky Labs. You know, American government knew for quite a while that there was a lot of back-end type, you know, the Russian government was all, there was lots of information being sent out. It took us literally years to get Kaspersky Labs off the GSA acquisition list. We were giving a preferred status as a software product to purchase. So we are going to, again, not be able to just, we're going to have to do this in concert with you guys so that we can recognize before we buy all these things and have this infected. And I go back to IoT as a classic place where almost all the devices are being actually made in China in the IoT realm. We've got to have some security standards. Now, how we get government to get its act together in an organized way to address this threat proactively, I'm going to leave that to you academic guys. You're the futurists. You're the futurists.
We need a new president.
But it is crazy that we are using aggressive national security justifications to break all existing norms and put tariffs on Canada. But we have known infiltrators putting bugs into the United States government computer systems like, I guess we can't do anything about that. So there are examples of countries that are leading the way, maybe often small countries like Israel and Singapore that are small enough that they can get their minds around this problem. We can always learn from countries like that. So what do you think are the lessons that we can learn from Israel and Singapore and others?
The first thing to say is this is such a depressing conversation. We really have to serve drinks at this thing. So no for HBO. I do think that Israel in particular provides an interesting case study. And of course, as you identify, it's not entirely possible for something as complex and big as American society and government to follow suit. But if you look at what they've done, they've had a strong sense of the strategic importance of cybersecurity, computer technology, all the rest, and have kind of woven it into an integrated flow between academia, both in terms of education, and I don't mean that there's some scholarships for people to go to a top computer science program. I mean, you see it all the way down into primary education, this prepping of the field to grow lots and lots of talented future technologists. And it'll bear lots of fruit, but some of it will bear fruit that's specifically relevant for cybersecurity and information and that sort of thing. And then making sure that this is integrated with smart ways of bringing that talent into their intelligence community and their military. And of course, Israeli society already brings, quite fully understand, but we're researching. They seem to have created a pretty good ebb and flow between the private sector and especially their intelligence entities that are involved in this type of area, so that talent can go from one and go back, and so it's not a one-way street. The United States, traditionally the NSA, you wouldn't talk in terms of cybersecurity, you'd talk in terms of mathematics, and they would always say, we hire the most mathematicians, it's the best place to be an advanced mathematician in the world. I think it's still true to some extent, but the truth is, with the emergence of cybersecurity-related talents and experience, the attraction to the private sector is, and not to mention the pay, but just the excitement and the sizzle with private sector technology, it's too much. NSA can barely compete. Cyber Command with uniformed service members, they're not going to be able to compete. And DHS, we won't even go there. So it's a huge problem, and it suggests that one of the ways we need to think about this is from a personnel and training perspective, where we break out of the very siloed, traditional 20th century models and have a much more flexible workforce. And the ability, for example, I think there's a bill pending, I think in the House, it might be a McCall bill. Chairman McCall, I think, has an idea about being able to relatively easily go from the private sector briefly for a time to work in government, and vice versa, and have almost a trade approach. And Senator, you may know more about that bill.
Let me just get in the let's see how much we can bum you out on a beautiful Saturday mode. Again, follow up on Bobby's point. There is some legislation, kind of a cyber reserve corps. Two quick factoids. We have about 250,000 unfilled cyber jobs in America at this point. That number's on the low end. I know I got like 36,000 in Virginia. Average starting salary, 88 for a long time to come. And the notion of how we pump that pipeline, really, really important. But to your point about going back and forth, just on the kind of the oh my gosh, I can't believe we're still operating this way. Even if somebody wants to go work for the NSA or Cybercom or the FBI or CIA or DHS, the mission is really, we can never compete with the private sector of the federal government, but mission is important. But what young mathematician, scientist, engineer is going to sit for an hour or in their jobs? Because our security clearance process, partially due to the century technology, where we make the tools of technology that we all talk about, what's called continuous evaluation. So it's not every 5 years we look at you whether you need to or not, but you prioritize. You can use all these tools we've talked about in cyberspace to clear up that backlog. And we had a major hearing on this past week. Doesn't get a lot of attention, but if we're going to get the talent in and people who I think will step up as Americans to do the mission, we desperately have to break through this security clearance problem.
Yeah. Another one of these ironic moments, we have these hundreds of thousands of people who are supremely qualified, who want to work in the United States government, but they can't because they can't get security clearance. And then we have another set of people who perhaps are less qualified, who are working at the highest levels of government. Go figure. So I have a few minutes for, that's just my own view, that's not attributable to the United States Senate or the University of Texas or Capital Factory or my mother. So a few minutes for questions, so please.
Yeah, I'm going to use the mic since it's on.
Thank you so much for having this important discussion here today. It's something we care a lot about at Twitter. I have a question for Senator Warner. You talked a lot about the backlog and some of the challenges on the government end. Could you speak to your thoughts on how the IC can collaborate or cooperate or provide information?
And one, let me partially thank you from Twitter being willing to kind of start to work with us. We all remember the Facebook CEO famously said afterwards, when I first started raising this, he said, oh, there's no there there. And I believe, let's just take Facebook for example, so we won't have to continue to talk about Twitter, but, you know, I believe after a year and 4 months after the attack, and French have a very different set of rules than on the First Amendment and other things. In France, Facebook working with the French government took down 30,000 plus sites before the French election. Now a year and 4 months later, Facebook has only identified 470 accounts in terms of Russian activity. I gotta tell you, if there's 30,000 plus accounts on France, now it's again not complete apples to apples, I gotta assure you there was more than just one troll factor. And respectfully, all the work that Twitter, Reddit, which is a smaller platform but has complete anonymity, you know, they haven't even worked at all with the committees and others. And my fear is, you know, there will be the easy stuff to do, such as legislation. We've got something called the bipartisan legislation with John McCain and Amy Klobuchar and I, called the Honest Ads Act, which at least says, you know, if a political ad is paid for in rubles, which was the only accounts that Facebook initially reported on, then maybe an American ought to know that. It took us a little while back to say, go check those things. Get that right. The best, not our job. Or you will see not only Section 230, but you will see a whole changes which would require, you know, some responsibility for the content, but you will see even more. So let's get our act together. Yep.
Right? Yep.
Hi, my name's Leon Bernstein. I'm with the Global Shapers, actually. I had a quick question here, but how do you get that set of rules established? It almost seems to me like asking Russia or China to abandon the Manhattan Project in 1945. If they're winning, why would they give that up?
Well, great question. I'm going to give you at least a couple of steps. One of the things I want to try to do in the next few months is bring together at least parliamentarians from all the Western nations that have been attacked. And let's start with the West and, you know, just sit down. I mean, we had the parliamentary inquiry from the over recently and met with the chairman, Richard Bernstein. We need to sit together. And none of this stopped, by the way, with the election. Players, in terms of the standing or kneeling on the national anthem, originated. I do think there will be, because the tools are getting so powerful. I do think President Obama and President Xi made fairly good progress. You guys will recall when, back was it 2014, 2015, when there was kind of a important moment where I think President Obama said, you've got to at least cut out the basic stealing our intellectual property. And that, you know, we've seen that trend down. How we deal with it with Russia, or how we deal with it with people who work maybe for a government at night, for a criminal syndicate at night, or I mean, for a government during the day and a criminal syndicate at night, you know, it's going to take you all helping us figure this out. But I think we have to start with the West. We have seen some movement with China, because they have a lot to lose as well. Because we do all have tools. And what we've been unwilling to do as a nation, and this is where we get into the whole, whether you even want a cyber doctrine or not, is because we have been, and the West has been much more technologically advanced, we've been afraid of any kind of escalation on the cyber front. And instead we've tried to do it through other means, like we're going to sanction a bunch of bad guys, or we're going to restrict something. Because, you know, at least until recently, if you shut down the systems and the power in Moscow for 24 hours, you got a problem. If you shut down the power and systems in New York and all the financial systems, you have chaos. So our technological advantage in an asymmetrical conflict has made us more vulnerable in this area. Now, though, I think with the tools getting more and more powerful, and, you know, if you look at WannaCry and NotPetya and some of these recent attacks where, you know, it moved beyond the borders of the country they were trying to focus on and crept into Russia, there ought to be some awareness that everybody's got some skin in the game.
Dave, how are we doing time-wise?
We've got 20 minutes.
Oh, good. Hi, Anthony Arona. I work for the Julie Oliver for Congress campaign. My question's for Senator Warner, but I'd love to hear you guys if you have ideas. Politically, how do we as citizens, and you as an elected official, apply pressure to an administration that doesn't just seem to not want to favor for me on two things, and I'm just
killing time so that we can go back to hear the senator's answer, which is what everybody actually wants to hear. But as I said before, I mean, our country, we're facing two fundamental almost, and that everything, every institution that we have doesn't, it's not that it exists in the world, it exists in our minds. And we create those cultures. And it's much easier, vision is part of it, but it's being fed very, very actively. And it's a much bigger threat than I think we all can appreciate, because the things that are changing aren't concrete. If they blew up power stations, we'd say, well, there was a power station, now there's not. If people stop paying their taxes, like in Greece, where people don't really pay taxes, it's not that it happened in one day. Somebody sent around a memo, hey, nobody pay your taxes, hide your money. It's just the institutions decay. So that's number one. Number two is that we have gotten lazy. That we've had such a monumental head start for almost 100 years, in all of our technology, our natural birthright, and it is not. And just as Boris was saying, that the leapfrog that can be made, not just in AI, but even that's why China is investing so much in electric cars, because we have, with the combustion engine, the cars that we have a head start. They're probably never going to catch up, but it's a new game with electric cars. So many of these new technologies, and if we don't face the threat to our institutions and the challenge to our overall economy and well-being, then we are really in trouble. That was just a stall, but here's the senator.
Well, again, agree with what Jamie said, agree with what Bobby said. Let me give you the bad news and the good news. There is some good news here. Bad news is, one of the things that has been, believer in our system, that was probably the most bothersome to me through this whole last year and a half. You know, it's been hard to have attack our committee or attack Special Prosecutor Mueller, but you then saw some of his allies, in effect, be willing to do kind of ad hominem attacks against our basic institutions, such as the FBI or the Justice Department. In many ways, I would argue that the Russians didn't really think Trump was going to win, so they messed with a bunch of voting systems so that, remember, President Trump was the only political candidate in my mind that ever said before the election he might question the results. And they almost left enough digital dust so that somebody would discover that after the fact. And this kind of attack on our institutions, and you saw, the one gentleman that Mueller was supposed to come in, maybe he was just a little unusual guy, but at the beginning of the week, who said, I'm not going to go testify. When people start saying that they're going to choose which laws they're going to adhere to, you got a society in chaos. So that's why this is so important beyond kind of the particulars of Mr. Trump. The good news is this. I don't know a single person that Mr. Trump has appointed, in terms of national security or the IC or the criminal justice system, that doesn't fully acknowledge this problem and gets it and knows that we need to step up. The good news is, my hope is that, regardless of where you fall in the political spectrum, we cannot allow the Mueller investigation to be shut down before we finish the truth. We should, when people take on ad hominem attacks against our institutions, stand up for them. And I think you will see, the effort to try to bring in the Europeans to point out to the American people, this is not some witch hunt or fairy tale, but this is a tool of modern conflict, and it's not just happening to us, will help maybe convince some of the non-believers. And then, on a more specific short-term basis, March 21st, our committee is going to come out with broadly a big hearing on election security and broadly bipartisan. And think about it.
My name is Adam Goodrum. I work for the Texas Democratic Party. Thank you guys for being here. Had a fair amount of discussion today about Russia and China, but I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the nature of the threat as well as the response or lack of to non-state actors in the cybersecurity realm.
Great question. I'm glad we're expanding beyond the major threat actors, because of course there's no shortage of threat actors. So you do hear a lot about cyber terrorism, and there are ways in which violent or non-state actor groups do get into this space. Generally speaking, that's relatively insignificant. It matters on the margins. It's not a terribly big concern. very much true about technology is that it diffuses over time. And if you think about it from a sort of a firearms perspective, the type of weapon that would be available 100 years ago, only, for example, to a military, later on, 100 years down the road, is in the hands of just any old person, as we've seen, who can get hold of it. Problem earlier, the ability to create really convincing false audio and false video. The people generating it, there's some stuff out on GitHub already that's pretty good. You don't have to be that good to make use of it, and that's going to quickly accelerate and become really ubiquitous in its availability. That in turn will mean that it would be a mistake to think that only Fancy Bear and Cozy Bear can do this, that you have to be a state actor to have these kinds of capabilities. And the terrifying thought is that, so you could have just a relatively small number of people, maybe who are just being jackasses and aren't even doing this for national strategic reasons, disrupting an election.
That's a political description.
That's a political so I think what we're talking about is sort of the ubiquity of disruptive technology. There's a really cool book I would tout by my Brookings colleague, Ben Wittes, and his co-author, Gabby Blum, called The Future of Violence. And the major theme is to look at a lot of current technological trends and show how the democratization of technological trends create more and more ability for sort of peer-to-peer harms. They were really focused on violence, but we're talking about a non-physical form of something quite analogous. Now, in the usual telling of this story, technology is both the cause of and then the solution to the problem, much like Homer Simpson once said that beer is like the cause of and solution to most of life's problems. I'm not 100% sure how that's going to work out in the information space, and that there is this back and forth between the offense and the defense that history suggests that eventually there is the defensive counter, and technology enables that, but it's on some of these technologies it's not clear how that's going to work.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Jonathan Morgan. I work at a company called New Knowledge that focuses on this problem from a technology perspective. And I'm curious, you talked a lot about the bipartisan support for this in a national security context. And I understand why there's a strong focus on Russian influence in our elections. But a little over a week and a half ago, there was a report released of U.S. domestic energy production. And I'm curious if the committee or others in government will kind of expand the lens of
the information space. I mean, at some point, if somebody attacks your society, it's an attack like another attack, maybe economic sanctions or some kind of other response might be appropriate.
Well, I think so far, that's frankly been most of the ways that we have responded. Have been not in the information space, but we sanction folks. And this again goes to the question around attribution, which on one hand I'd love to sure that, and others have said, you may get into a tit for tat, and this is where the earlier gentleman's question about how we make sure we get everybody in the tent, because if everybody starts exposing what we've done to each other in this space, there are no clean hands. One of the things I think that indirectly part of Jonathan's question is, all these tools that were kind of still fresh in 2016 election in terms of the ability to disrupt for a relatively small amount of money. I mean, what we know about so far, 80 trolls in a single facility, a number of bots, and peanuts in terms of paid advertising. And look at the effect it had. Again, way less than a tank. Way less than you add up all the countries in terms of the airplane. These same tools can be used to disturb known brand names. It'd be very cheap to take down a brand. It'd be very cheap. I actually think, we were talking earlier, I think the whole world, and this will again make some folks upset, but I think there's a whole lot of scam in the whole digital advertising space in terms of bots and click farms and others. I think there's kind of the emperor has no clothes that really needs a little more authentication around the basic business model. I think the ability to manipulate stock prices. I mean, you can just go. You can go to a variety of places. Now, I hope, I think these, take the Equifax for a moment, and then try to go out and sell it on the dark web. There may be something that's taking, a fraction of a cent on every transaction that never gets exposed. That is going to come, and again, my hope, since it's going to come, one, we need to shine a light on it, and two, maybe that will also help. Back to your question, build up the political will that we can all say, hey, we're all in this and we all have something to lose. And candidly, there's no Democrat or Republican. This is much more a question of not liberal conservative, it's much more future past. And the policymakers that are future leaning, I think are going to get it more, but and we ought to keep it in that frame so we don't default back to D versus R.
Dave, how are we doing time-wise?
We have 7 minutes.
Perfect. All right. And
Lightning round.
what we can do is actually, if you have a paper, what I'm going to do is we're going to start answering questions. So if anybody has a question, I'd love to, or a comment, love to make sure that you have a chance to say. So we'll start with you and you. And I don't know who there's a microphone that's coming around. Yeah, so it'll come to you. Oh, I'm sorry. And then I robbed the guy in the back. And so he's next. Is there anyone to 1, 2, 3 for this? And, yeah.
Hi, I'm Selena with CNN. So my question is around what you were talking about earlier regarding, kind of considering platforms' role here, and soft panels are often, reluctant to talk about is regulation of these tech platforms. And I'm kind of curious as to your thoughts if that's something that one platform regulation just sort of solves some of these problems.
Got it. All right. So now the woman back here.
I swear we don't know each other, but my question is very simple. A little bit for regulating tech platforms, and you said we might need to go further than Section 230, just to be a little nerdy here for those who don't know. Section 230 is basically what it shields websites from liability for what users post on their sites. So I'm wondering what you see if we go further than 230, what that looks like, and are you looking at kind of like what the European model is looking for, or British model?
Great. All right. Then we'll get. Okay. Perfect. Sorry, so platform regulation.
I want to make a lot of news here. No, listen. There is already right now a broadly bipartisan bill on it takes on part of Section 230 about sex trafficking, and I'm not co-sponsored yet, but because I think I'd rather, if we do this in a collaborative fashion, I think that would be a better route. But I think the American people's patience is starting to run thin. And again, respectfully, that I don't think, for example, the platform companies have fully leaned in. They know a lot more about their users, a lot more about their content, and a lot more about their algorithms than USG knows. I also think, just to be a little bit provocative today, I mentioned if you're going to have a cyber doctrine, we ought to have a debate about software liability. Now, that has been, nobody wanted to go there for a long time. But, there was never liability for automobiles for the first 30, 40 years until these companies had so much power that it was the public interest to have some level of liability. Now, boy, liability in software, how long will it last? What's the level of due care? What happens about a software program that no longer is out there? What's your ongoing liability? But the fact that Equifax didn't put the patch in place 6 months after the fact and then screwed up the website when everybody's personal information was taken, and frankly, in a company relationship that we have no personal direct customer relationship with, there should be a penalty paid, and it shouldn't be a slap on the wrist. So this is the kind of debate we need to have with you guys as part of the tech company to get it right, because what you don't want to have happen is a bunch of us in Washington or in Austin or in Richmond in my state doing this in a non-collaborative fashion, because then we'll mess it up.
So Twitter, don't be Pinto. Any on this side? Is it just this last one? Okay, take us home.
Thank you. My name is Mihana. Thank you very much for being here. I'm with the Global Shippers, and I do science and technology policy advocacy. I wanted to ask, because we spoke a little bit about Chinese mercantilism. It's not necessarily about Russia cybersecurity or anything, but we spoke about Chinese mercantilism and theft of IP. And Senator, you said that the IP theft has kind of gone down a little bit, but what has gone up in the past few years is acquisitions. So for one key example was China has been acquired KUKA, the European automation, the largest robotics manufacturer in Europe. And now we have, although that's not a Chinese company, Broadcom is trying to acquire Qualcomm. It's a Singapore-based, it used to be an American company, right? So now they are trying to acquire the IP through legal means. And now the Qualcomm board is, they want to go through with the acquisition. But now what's the position of, your position obviously, and what do you think should DOJ do about that? I mean, where are we on that, and what should happen here?
Yeah, I think you've already mentioned it, but
Yeah, let me just, one, the case of, this is where we have to be, I think, careful. I don't know all the details on the Broadcom circumstances. But my understanding is, that there is the CEO or Chinese ancestry, is Singaporean. So you just have to have a lot of sensitivity. But we do not have in place the tool Chinese entity will acquire or invest in a Canadian entity or a Mexican entity, and then that entity will come in. And then I also believe, what may happen as well is that some of these large, the 20 plus that are north of 20 billion, some of which are already brand names in China and now throughout most of Asia, will within 5 years be brand names in America. And they may not even have to acquire a company to come into a marketplace. So the CFIUS process, which is our current, very much kind of last century, has to be updated. And, chances are we're probably not going to get it 100% right. And one of the things that Congress, this is editorial comment beyond the kind of subject of the day, this is, I'll give you a real insider tip. Congress, no matter which party's in control, never gets it fully right the first time. Whether it's Dodd-Frank or Affordable Care Act or the so-called tax reform plan, what we've got to be willing to do though is have a political process that isn't paralyzed, makes a policy choice, and then comes back and corrects. I mean, I was a venture capitalist longer than I'm a politician. Invested in a lot, co-founder of Nextel, invested in a lot, 150 plus companies. I've never invested in a company that ever met its business plan. The companies that worked were the ones that were able to adjust and twist. And frankly, one of the problems with our paralysis in government at this point is we're not, as a government, able to adjust because both sides get dug into whatever their position is. So editorial comment on the side. I think CFIUS is going to change.
Yes, so
We're at time.
okay, well, thank you all so much. Thank you, Bobby. Thank you, Senator Warner, and thank you, all of you. So enjoy our time.
Feel free to grab a beer on your way out. Just remember Austin.
They're just giving it up. What's that? We're looking at this.
So I don't know, Robin, that guy there was talking about us.
Okay, you
were walking in, and laughing before you could get like, all right, like past reception. All right, I'll grab it.
Hey, I'm Sarah Shields from Open Austin.
Oh, you're the. I got.
So I know the city is
That's what I did.
I read this morning that Intel was considering to put
make other investment arguments. That's the kind of smart government process that might actually create value instead of just blocking it.
Thank you.
Yeah, good stuff though.
Yeah, very much so. Thank you. Do you happen to have a card at all?
I don't know, I'm such a clueless academic. You know about easy to find, Bobby Chestnut. Search me up and send me notes.
Good.
Yeah, good. All right, yeah, good talking to you.
You're second on this. My girlfriend is first. You're after her.
Where's she from?
Hi, Bobby. Good to meet you.
Yeah, I teach here at the university. Oh, fantastic. Yeah, that's great. Almost no one. They're not right. Some attractions. No. The only people I know there are Carl, Cheryl Martin. Those are my
So I work on so basically I work on the engine sector. Rockets kind of like a balloon.
Oh yeah.
Don't get me wrong.
Right. But it'd be nice to have something reusable.
I mean, like, doesn't
Eventually it'll catch up with that. We'll fly. He's offering what? And that's actually
not bad. That's the price. The price. Do you know what it costs to make
no idea. Well, I guess the whole
well, this is what I mean. So when the plane lands in the Hudson River, God bless you, sir. When you see pictures of astronauts floating in the ocean, emissions.
Yeah, like, way to go. So it seems like there's a real problem that these all be able to converge and they're the same functionality.
Oh, no way. And so that's the area that I work in. And it's just...
That's very good. Have you met this guy? He's a new aerospace engineering professor here in Moriba job. He's a NASA, he's an orbital mechanics guy who specializes in space vaguely related to security or foreign affairs. People don't do whatever want. Because Moriba is not here, he's just joined from NASA. It's a really dynamic dude. We're going to hire some people who are policy and legal experts, mainly on space traffic management, debris, and clutter. But we are kind of creating this incipient just space and satellites for now. But what you do, the suborder is obviously incredibly relevant too. So I don't have a card, but if you would, you could reach out and send it in.
No, I would. Actually, it's a weird tangential thing. So, I do a lot of SciComm.
Okay.
Pet projects as a passion, I suppose. So I've written stuff from Fortune before, for instance.
So you're used to translating these ideas into policy.
Right. And I mean, it's a strange aside, the work I can inform has featured my project through these various outlets and outlets that is made policy. It's a strange and sensitive service. No, I'd be very happy to talk about it.
Would you mind tell me when you
It's a very interesting topic. I really am.
do you shoot your thanks, man. We have no.
Right, smile everybody. You've got to get the silly one now. It's 2
Yeah, Jamie and I had two Johnson's graduation anxieties. He's very impressive. Let us know anytime you might want to come back to Austin. It's not South by. We have these national security programs. We've had lots of your colleagues report in terrible time. We have a pretty good platform. It's a lot of attention.
Yep. I'll send you an email. I'll get it back to you.
I'll keep posted through you. It was a lot of fun. Thanks for listening. I'm telling you, it's going to happen because I think that, look, talking about regulation, you're going to bottom up by creating live events, but you're going to smooth it out.
Will be much better.
We should. He's an Australian cybersecurity
but I haven't done it. Not great. From
a weapons perspective.
See, that's interesting because I'm interested in missiles from a because like, the only difference between ICBM
Yeah, that's right. It's actually it's total dual use, classic dual use. We caught up.
I did a crawl last night, which is exhausting in its own right. He sells it on trend.
and so what happens is most nations just abandon
It's important not to always have
there's like people that I need to see because they're like contact that other companies that would be like, oh hey, you're the person that's I'm a real person. I have I'll probably I'm sure I will go see Tim.
during like the movement, right? Yeah, we crashed that part. Still did it. And this is Chinese flag that we build this famous, we own you, like China in the South China Sea, right? So how can you
they decide to build up there, they're going to pick the prime.
And they say, this is my ice, I own this one.
Right. And if these guys are willing to build islands in South China Sea, they'll show us how to build a food base on the ice.
Right, where there's no people. Right? And so to me, I have to get all worried about this because it's like you build a space base, it's over the end, that's how it's doing.
No, absolutely. Really pretty increasingly enable you to do things alongside them, maybe otherwise don't do.
Oh, don't even happen to that. Like, what makes more sense? Imagine you live on a tiny tributary right? You build a tiny little boat and run it down because that's the only one you can get down the tributary, and then you brave the ocean waves and you crack a little road.
Right.
So you sail down to the river mouth and build yourself a dry dock, and then you build an ocean liner.
Right.
The analogy there is you fly down the river, which is made almost exactly the same as the you build a mill base.
Lighter gravity is easier.
You found it on one side, already in orbit.
Launch is much easier, yeah.
Alright,
You want to Mars?
You want a microsat in orbit of Jupiter? Well, we'll build a railgun. Foregoing international complaints about building a gun on the moon. But we'll build a railgun on the moon, and we'll fire satellites for free with no rocket, just electricity, solar. Out into our solar system, don't even fucking game. Just start
Look at gravity will pick it up. What is some of
There's no air resistance, so you can just shoot them off, and now there you go. Blah, 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 blah. Right? And that's what you do. You fab them all on the moon, and the charge in orbit just does it around for a little bit. You fly a rocket. Yeah, what's there? That's it. That's the end of it. That's a much more. I actually read about that.
So are you in a research? I was this morning.
I'm not. Really? Well, the question was lucrative in China or research. I don't understand. Should make sure that the how about you?
Right, yeah, exactly.
I mean, they are borrowing like crazy. Their debt is blowing up in comparison to the GDP so fast in like such a short amount of time. Compared to us, right?
Because they're just trying to acquire.
Just acquire everything, right? I was in Washington. I was an ITIF event in the capital, and there was this guy from the embassy sitting down there, and he was asking Robert Atkinson before the he was saying China is just acquiring everything in Europe. They're buying everything, right? They don't really care. Right? So I mean, when people are concerned about robotics and AI, they're acquiring everything in the entire ecosystem, the entire supply chain, hardware, robotics, AI. So why are we not concerned about that? We should be. Coming into America, it's not defeated. No, we shouldn't be concerned about that.
And they even to Senator Warren's point, he said that they just go through governments. They acquire another company.
But now you got all of that, and then China it's not about them using it, it's about us not using it. We're having to pay for it.
Right. Yes.
It's not just
At their discretion.
at their discretion.
They become the gatekeepers of the future.